I'm very excited to be sharing a bit of Afro-Mexican history, US Black history for such an important month. So I'm going to be sharing my screen with you. Also, please write down any questions or anything that might not be as clear. We'll answer them towards the end of the session as we only have an hour. And this is 500 years of history, basically, I have to go through, so bear with me. All right, so can everyone see my screen properly? Is everything great?
Yes.
So today's session is titled African Indigeneity Throughout the Diaspora, AfroLatin History. And what I want to do today is to tie together the history of the displaced African peoples that arrived to the Americas during the 15th century. Folks were enslaved in what is now Mexico a bit before they were enslaved in what is now the US. But I also wanted to tie relationships between indigenous and African descended folks in both territories, as thanks to current racism, there is a lot of attempts to bring animosity between Black folks and indigenous folks, ignoring the fact that liberation is collective and everyone will be benefited by this, and capitalism pits us against each other instead of tying together our relationships. And the other part I really wanted to highlight is the fact that there are many Afro-Indigenous communities, not only in Mexico, but also in the US. Blackness and indigeneity aren't as separate as we are made to think by mainstream narratives. So what we're going to talk about a bit today is who the first enslaved folks were in the Americas. They were first in the Caribbean, but in continental America, it was in what is now called Mexico and Guatemala and many other countries. New Spain was a very large territory. We're going to put the presence of African people in New Spain into context, as just as narratives regarding slavery in the US are people passively accepted slavery, white folks had to come and liberate enslaved people. We're going to question those types of narratives in Mexico as well, and talk a bit about the projects of whitening and erasure of Black and Indigenous folks, and in many cases, Afro-Indigenous people as well. And I also want to talk a bit about how folks in Mexico, Black folks, had many ways of evading many of the most violent realities of slavery. There were many ways to navigate the system from within or escaping. And I really think it's important to talk about all of this and not just say, oh, it was slavery, no resistance until the 19th century, and that's it, because that is not the case. And finally, I'm going to talk about Blackness across the border, the relationship between the US South, the larger area of the Caribbean. Louisiana is part of the South, of the Caribbean. Texas is part of the Caribbean. Veracruz, many parts of Mexico are part of the Caribbean. And that is important for us to understand how Blackness and Black folks communicate across all these artificially created borders. And finally, I'm going to mention some artists, either Afro-Mexican, Blaxicans, which is folks that have both Black and Mexican heritage that live in the US, and Afro-Indigenous artists that are highlighting all of this work and their identities within both territories. Also, I want to begin by talking about the differences between Anglo and Spanish slavery systems. Why? Because many historians here in Mexico, particularly those that study colonial history, have a very racist perspective. There is not enough of an anti-racist um, formation during our studies. So there's a lot of racist narratives that just get passed by mostly white historians. So one of these narratives is that Spanish slavery wasn't quote unquote as bad as Anglo slavery because folks were able to move around more. There was more physical liberties. They weren't necessarily in chains, literally. However, what I would like to propose is the idea that while the dynamics were quite different, They both ended in the dehumanization of and the creation of anti-Blackness and the dehumanization of Black folks. And they developed the same way. Even though our dynamics are different, we have a assimilationist form of racism instead of a segregationist form of racism like the US. These are both terrible. We can't say that one wasn't better than the other. It's like saying, would you rather drown or get thrown off a cliff? They're both awful. Why would I have to pick? So, just because they're different does not mean they can even be compared. That's the other thing. We don't have to say something was better or worse to understand the gravity of these situations. And while I will discuss some that slavery in Mexico was visually also very different from the narratives we may get from media in the US, that doesn't mean it was less terrible, that folks weren't physically, mentally abused, that families weren't separated. So that's something I just really wanted to begin with, precisely because these are historians. These are people with, all the academic titles that are saying these things with their chest while not realizing the harmful stereotypes that are being conserved by keeping these ideas. Also, I want to clarify what language I'm going to be using today. So I'm a writer. Words matter a lot to me, and I really want to share my reflections regarding what words I use to talk about Afro-Mexican history, about Black folks, and why I think it's important we become conscious of the language we use while discussing these situations. So first of all, it's very common in Mexico now for Afro-Mexican folks and Afro-Mexican communities to be referred as the third root. Why? Because the official narrative regarding race in our country is that we are a mestizo nation, which means that we are all quote unquote mixed because we have one Spanish root or European root and one indigenous root. And it's also very racist in the sense that it combines all indigenous communities into this one, like, very general indigenous root. And so in the last around 30 years that the Afro-Mexican movement has started to gain visibility, now the official narrative is, oh, well, Afro-Mexican people, Black Mexicans, are the third root. And I take issue with this because it's not questioning the official narrative that says that we're all mixed, which is a lie. And it's just sort of attaching Black folks as an afterthought, like, oh, right, you're the third root. And it still continues with these logics of hierarchies and who's on top and who's below. And so, for example, I'm also of Japanese descent, not recent. My great grandfather migrated to Mexico over 100 years ago. And I'm not the only person. There's quite a lot of Chinese, Korean, Japanese migrants that came to Mexico over the last 100 years. So if there is an Asian movement coming up soon, are they going to be the fourth route? And also, Lebanese and Arab communities migrated to Mexico during the late 19th and early 20th century. So are they the fourth route or are they the fifth route? So it's all just this very racist idea of categorizing the supposed roots while ignoring the systemic racism that contributes to the erasure or the visibility of any of these roots at any given time. The other thing I want to mention is that instead of talking about slaves, I talk about enslaved people. Why? Because the idea of the slave is very ontological. Philosophically, it says that is who you are, that is your essence, that is all that defines you and all that is worth mentioning about your condition. Nonetheless, I prefer to talk about enslaved people because it talks about the active action whereupon others decide to impose this oppression upon you, this exploitation upon you. It takes away responsibility from the enslaved person that is who you are, and it places it on the person that oppresses you consciously. As well, instead of talking about masters, I talk about enslavers because that is what they did. It's people that consciously decided to enslave others around them for their own personal gain. Um, in academia and academic texts, it's also very common to see Afro-descendant, Afro-Mexican, or Black people referred to simply as Blacks. And while I understand that that's part of the historic context and language has evolved over time, I also want to call attention to Blacks as just being a very general and could possibly become even a derogatory term And I always try to use Afro-Mexican, Black, Afro-descendant people at the end because that's the important thing. I'm thinking, I propose to discuss critically how these people are talked about in history. The other thing is that for me, it's very important as an Afro Mexican person to visualize and to respect the history of my own ancestors. My ancestors weren't just simply slaves and that's it, or my ancestors don't deserve to be talked about as just this very general mass of oppressed people, but rather folks that went through a lot of violence, that were kidnapped from their homes, but that managed to adapt, to survive, and even to thrive, even though that was not what was planned for them. And finally, just as a last detail, I also think about who is writing these texts, who is developing the narratives regarding the history of Afro Mexican people. And what I've found in a lot of cases, unfortunately, is historians thinking that they are quote unquote objective when we know that the mere idea of objectivity is a characteristic of white supremacy and white supremacist thinking. So you can't just simply extricate yourself from politics and the political orientation of your research. You have to actively decide how you want to participate in these conversations, right? So I always try to highlight writers that and historians that actively take this into consideration for their work. So just to do a very quick rundown, the folks that were enslaved in what is now Mexico were mostly from West Africa. So what is now Senegal, Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, all this area, and afterwards a bit from the Bantu peoples, but West African was uh, the region of origin where most Black people were kidnapped and taken to New Spain. This is a map of contemporary Mexico, just so you get an idea. And the first enslaved peoples were either brought through the port of Veracruz, which is right on the Gulf of Mexico. It's in the large Caribbean, culturally and geographically, it's part of the Caribbean. And they were taken either to Veracruz or on the Pacific side to Acapulco, which is now the state of Guerrero. And it's important to mention this because even at present, the 2020 census was the first time Afro Mexican people were actively counted and considered.